violence, conflict, and civil war in Africa. I should have said last week, the structure to these lectures at the beginning of term 2 is really that weeks 13, 14, and 15 are about direct and often violent threats to the state. So it's all the nasty stuff, basically. Last week was resistance and overthrow. Today is violence, civil war, genocide, these kind of friendly topics. Next week is state fragility and state collapse. And then the role of sort of weeks 16 and 17 is to put the state back together again. A bit like Humpty Dumpty. All kind of reparative work is going to be done when we start to talk about things like peace building, transitional justice, economic development, all of those sorts of things. So that's kind of the logic of where this little cluster of 4 or 5 topics kind of goes. And obviously, if we're going to talk about violence and mass conflict in Africa, we're talking about, unfortunately, a very common and very topical issue. As is always the case, you only have to look at your TV screens, turn on your radios to see all too many examples of African states that are currently experiencing some form of violence, some form of mass conflict. I guess the cases that have been most in the news in the last couple of weeks have been South Sudan. More than 1 million people have been forcibly displaced by the last 12 months' worth of violence in South Sudan. Cases like Boko Haram, obviously in northern Nigeria, a case that rumbles on and doesn't seem to have an easy resolution anytime soon. Longer-term cases that maybe drop out of the press for a while but then come back, like Somalia, like Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. And then lots and lots of cases of post-election violence over the last 2, 3, 5, 10 years. Cases like Cote d'Ivoire, Kenya, Zimbabwe, and others. So lots of cases that we can potentially talk about today. Obviously, I won't be able to cover all of them, but I do want to make reference to at least a few of those that I've mentioned already. And I guess one of the things that animates this lecture today is a kind of theme that runs all the way through this GPA course, which is that, especially around issues of violence and conflict in Africa, there's an extremely crass and reductionist literature that often talks about conflict in Africa in very stereotypical and often very apocalyptic terms. And so, if nothing else, what I'm trying to do today is add a little bit of nuance, a little bit of grey into these debates, and also to suggest that maybe conflict in Africa is not that unusual from conflict, and especially cases of violent conflict that we see in other parts of the world. And so that's something that I'm going to try and get across in the next sort of 40 minutes or so. Last week I departed from my usual structure, and it didn't work. And I could tell it didn't work. It's a bit like trying to do punk rock and then deciding you're going to do jazz. There's no jazz today. We're going to go back to kind of 3 chords. We're going to kind of keep this nice and simple. I'm going back to the old way of doing things, of theory as a kind of introductory theme, key concepts, key debates, let's get those on the table. And then I'm going to end with 2 case studies that hopefully will sort of flesh out some of the theoretical ideas around violence and mass conflict in Africa. And I'll probably just stick with that for the rest of the course. You'll learn a few things, even at my age. Don't mess with what works. Don't try and get funky, especially at this stage. Pointless. Okay. So let's start with the theory. And when we're talking about violence and mass conflict in Africa, there are 2 major theoretical debates that sort of dominate the literature. The first big debate is about what are the fundamental causes and functions of conflict. That's a debate, and I'm going to kind of try to trace the major sort of disagreements in the literature on causes and functions of especially armed conflict in Africa. And then the second debate is going to be about who are the major actors in armed conflict in Africa. Who should we think of as primarily responsible? And related to that is a question about what levels of actors are we talking about when we try to understand how and why violence happens on the African continent. So those are the kind of the two major theoretical debates. So on the first one about causes and functions of conflict, as is often the case with many of the topics in this course, our good old friends Kaplan and Huntington have a fair bit to say here. Now, I don't have to rehearse their arguments totally here because you've been bombarded with Kaplan and Huntington since week 1 of GPA. But especially in the case of Kaplan, given that his piece, The Coming Anarchy, is essentially a dissection of causes of conflict in Africa. I mean, he's looking primarily at Sierra Leone, but he's trying to make a bigger argument about conflict in Africa. You know, we've sort of seen a little bit of this already. But this is where Kaplan's idea of anarchy or madness is a key issue in trying to understand the causes of conflict in Africa. His argument, essentially, if we were to boil it down in that piece, is that we should understand mass violence in Africa as fundamentally criminal as opposed to ideological. So his big argument is what you're seeing in the civil wars in Liberia and Sierra Leone in the early 1990s is a different type of conflict, a different type of violence from what we have seen really in most parts of the world leading up until then. He's trying to make a case that there's something different going on in African conflict zone. And that in many ways these are much less ideological. To a certain extent, they're less political than many cases of mass violence that we may have seen elsewhere. We should understand this fundamentally in terms of criminal behaviour and criminal motivations, just on a very, very large scale. That's essentially Kaplan's argument. And he's also trying to say this isn't just about Liberia and Sierra Leone. He thinks that this is starting to capture so many other cases of mass conflict across Africa. And of course, as I talked about all the way back in week 1 of term 1, you know, Kaplan's article took on a life of its own because of its proximity to the events in Rwanda in 1994. You'll remember that his article, The Coming Anarchy, was faxed to every US embassy around the world in March of 1994, and then with the Rwandan genocide beginning the following month, this piece took on an enormous resonance and seemed to confirm many of the events that US and other international diplomats were having to deal with at that time. So this idea of sort of criminal, diffuse, unpredictable, and often apolitical violence was, you know, a big part of the atmosphere, especially in the early to mid-1990s. And then Huntington's work, you know, kind of compounded a lot of these ideas about violence that Kaplan had introduced into the debate, especially Huntington's work around the clash of cultures and clash of civilizations, in which the argument is essentially that what we're seeing in Africa and other parts of the developing world, in Huntington's argument, is forms of intractable conflict because of fundamental cultural clashes. You know, his argument has lots and lots of strands to it, but a consistent theme is the inevitability of conflict. Because the minute that you have large-scale religious perspectives, particularly a clash between Christianity and Islam, it's only a matter of time before that manifests in mass violence. And Huntington also thinks that Africa is one of the arenas in which these clashes of cultures, these clashes of civilizations play out. And so Kaplan and Huntington really, you know, shaped this whole field of policy making and also scholarship around violence in Africa, especially in the 1990s. And one of the sort of interesting spin-offs of Kaplan and Huntington, and I'm not going to go into this too much here, but there was this whole literature that was around what some commentators called new wars. You'll see this a lot in the literature, this reference to the new wars theory. You know, Mary Kaldor at LSE, for example, is one of the major proponents of this. Now, clearly, it would be very unfair to the likes of Kaldor to put her in the category of Kaplan and Huntington, so she's trying to say something very different. But what she has in common with them is an argument that there's something different going on in conflict zones in Africa. There's something new about the forms that violence is taking. This idea that conflict is becoming more chaotic. It's becoming less